love it that people are reading new work. See, this is the same place, right? Nobody's going to throw anything yet. It's great hearing about. I've been meaning to go to Burning Man for years. And certainly, you know, I lived in California actually before. I lived in the Bay Area before Burning Man got born, and then lived in Tucson afterwards. So I thought, well, I was desert ready and I should go, but somehow it's just never happened. But it's one of those places I always wished I'd been in on from the get-go. When I was down in Baker Beach in San Francisco before it ever moved to Playa. But one of these days, we had a friend here from Austin who had an exhibit, a huge fish that used to be over at Garage Mahal. If anybody remembers that, that was their sculpture or their piece they were taking to Burning Man. And they had it on a flatbed trailer towing behind them. And they had their own Burning Man event on the way to Burning Man when the axles ran out of grease and the whole thing. It's just, you know, this is, I'm making it up. That the whole thing burned up before they got to Burning Man. Isn't that what happened?
Two different stories.
See, you weren't there either.
I remember a friend who had the RV brand new.
All right, well, it was an RV, but it, you know, they didn't make it. But anyway, Burning Man is one of those iconic things along with Terlingua that those of us here in Texas strive to attend. Okay, furthest away person to come tonight, Jane Rosenberg LaForge, New York, yes? What part?
Manhattan, Chelsea.
Chelsea, man. I used to live on 30th and 8th Avenue, so not too far from there. She's the author of a memoir, 2 full-length poetry collections, and 4 chapbooks, but she's got a novel now called The Hawkman, a fairy tale of the Great War. There's a paradox. Has been named by Publishers Lunch, BuzzBooks, as a book to watch. You were both being watched. She lives in New York with her husband and daughter, and she's here in Austin tonight. Please welcome Jane.
I'm very loud, so I do not need this.
But it's just that it picks up better
For the video.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm still very loud.
Okay.
So I'm going to read a couple excerpts from the novel, and they sort of fall into the theme tonight, not so much of close calls, but all the things about musicians. And before I start, I want to thank Allison very much for having me, and for my hosts, Kelly and Jason. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here, so thank you very much. So this is a book about a man who has been to war, and various things happen to him, and he befriends a lady, and then more things happen, and that's where this chapter comes in. Miss Williams explained that they were to walk to the estate of a Lord Thornton to deliver a book of poetry Miss Williams had inscribed. Were there an empire of conjurers of little worlds and fairy places? Let it be here in this green soil, in the high sweet grasses the mares sort through for their colts and fillies, in the blue fire stoves with their hushed smoke, in the island of pears and other orchards, generous with their shade and hours, she had written. She recited it as they walked arm in arm. She prattled on about the birds they saw, the trees that hosted them, the smell of the air. Alfalfa and periwinkle, as she identified it. The sky was a deeply seeded blue, she said, a profusion of blooms in sterling. This was how she wrote her poetry, she explained, auditioning lines to hear how they took to the atmosphere. She was not certain about that last one, and asked him to remember it so they would not have to stop for her to write it in her book. She fell slightly behind, as though she had stopped to listen to it again in her mind. She used his arm to pull herself forward. She fell behind again as they walked on more tenuous surfaces, particularly the polished stone that marked the walkways of the Thornton estate. Sheehan had not imagined she would tire so easily. When she stopped speaking in her trilling voice, he found it more difficult to muster any bravery. If he was not afraid as he had been in the war, it was only because he had so thoroughly drained whatever stores of fearlessness he had once accumulated. "Listen," she said, nearly breathless, as Lord Thornton's manor came into sight, our feet on the rocks like bells quickly stilled. He was sorry when the work was over, for walking, or more properly marching, had been a respite for him during the war. On marches there was light air, and when it rained, fresh water. In the camps there was the darkness of too many men who no longer knew themselves. They did not know whether to be grateful for being removed from the front or to be ashamed at having been taken away. There was a space and distance on the marches, sometimes exquisitely maintained. In the trenches, there was no such guarantee of movement or privacy, given the mud, vermin, and the men that stood at less than an elbow's length. On the marches, there was quiet, the discipline of keeping up. In war, there was whispers, men weeping, a raft of speculation breathing in the minds and bodies of his colleagues. Even after his capture, marching through a gauntlet of German towns, he had been more comfortable than he had been in other circumstances, knowing for the next stretch of moments what was expected of him. There were times townspeople spit on their parades or threw bed pots in their hair and faces, but they were to keep marching. He could even accept this abuse in principle, as he and the growing cadre of prisoners were anonymous. The fear did not begin until he reached the camp, and the hatred and deprivation would be slow and obvious. Once incarcerated by the Germans, he found there was more marching to be done, and marching on those commandos, whether to a farm or factory, was the safest of all. Sentries barked and men sickened, diseases and gangrene could not be outrun, but there was no need to prove loyalties, which is where zealotry and competition begins. There were no rumors, since there was only marching to get through, even if they were taken across France to build new camps for new prisoners due to overcrowding in the homeland. On the marches, there was no crowding, 500 men to a faucet, or 1,000. There was only the next step, and at some points not even the one after it. To place one foot ahead of the other so squarely, with the proper rhythm, was quite enough to accomplish. He was able to march as a prisoner of war, to walk, to wander as a beggar after the war, because he did not allow himself to think of a destination. But today, with Miss Williams on his arm, he most purposefully had an objective, even if he was not entirely certain as to the nature of their mission. Miss Williams knocked on the tall door, and they were met by a butler in full dress and polish. The butler escorted them from the atrium to a second-floor sitting room and library. Miss Williams thanked the butler and then asked him if he might show her a washroom. She was panting, as if only able to collect flat, shallow breaths, and her face showed the red of her exertions. "I only need to cool down a bit," Miss Williams said to Mr. Sheehan. "You'll be fine, and I will be back in seconds." When she left the room, he remained standing. He calmed himself by thinking he just let this Lord Thornton speak whatever gibberish his mind meted out for the occasion. Then Sheehan saw his own reflection in the ebony finish of a piece of furniture. But it was not merely furniture, though it may have been to his lordship, his family, and their servants. Sheehan knew it as something else entirely. He might investigate the piece further to help him compare himself to what he had been before the war and what he could be again. He wanted to approach the piece slowly, but rushed ahead, as he found that he could not keep still in its presence. A Bluthner. Sheehan smiled and inhaled that smile. German. He would have thought a man such as this lord or his predecessors would demand nothing less than a Broadwood, though if they had, it might not have spoken so well of the family's musical acumen. But he also knew the accumulations of an empire are inherently self-aggrandizing, and Sheehan posited there must have been someone in Lord Thornton's lineage who imagined going beyond the whims of a dilettante, so this piano was obtained. How it had survived the war and Lord Thornton not taking the patriotic action of destroying it was nothing short of a miracle. Sheehan did not immediately sit himself at the bench, but instead randomly put his fingers to keys as he imagined the mechanics he was setting off, the hammers and strings, and the sympathetic notes that Blumthners were known for. The aliquot string. He was more accustomed to the Becksteins that made their way to Ireland, the Collard and Collards. A Bluthner such as this he did not encounter until university. There were none in the music school. They were the instruments of symphonies. He had always been curious about this extra string, its indirect life, at a remove from the keys and yet closer to the source of the music. It was said to produce an effect more tender, romantic even, than other pianos. But what would it do to his beloved settee, with its silences as integral as the chords and dissonances? Would they be erased as if silences could be made mute? Would the echo destroy the original? He sat on the bench, placed the book of poems to his right. His hands fell as if they were still soft and ready, denuded of years and experience. But he mimed the Gymphonides first. I can't pronounce any of the French in this. His hands felt small, shrunken at the expanse of the keyboard. Perhaps they had shrunk from misuse, shoveling that kept them in an abbreviated grip, weeding in, which his fingers plucked and grabbed without reaching their full length, digging, molding, patting, all the actions that transformed fingers from free agents into implements of more immediate elements, earth, water, and wind. Or perhaps he had no fingers, only the slight differentiation of digits that a pod animal uses to grasp and scratch. His fingers had retracted, and as he played now in actuality, he felt initially as though he was using his knuckles, with his span so diminished. The sparse melody, the 1-2-1-2, came easily enough at his right hand. The haze in his ears almost parted, but he could not be certain. The agility of his fingers in the left hand was quite rough, but the wrist and arm could make up for some of the handicap, and he listened as the notes took longer to finish than he remembered. Whether it was the tantrum of noise in his head or the true production of the instrument, he could not determine. It made him stumble, poorly time his transitions. But the keys themselves were still like the prow of a narrowboat, taking in waves and eddies. They just did so at odd intervals, as he struggled to make them respond to his finger pads. They felt remote, trussed up in the insults to his skin he could not prevent. He was on the verge of mastering something, a kind of control, mainly of his expectations. Since he could not assume that he possessed as much control as in his earlier playing, he had to be more solicitous, less demanding of the instrument. He had to find a balance between what he knew of its theoretical possibilities and what was the actual result of his senses. He hesitated, repeated himself, balked at notes and phrases that struck him as incomplete, unburnished. What he could hear, make out of his performance, he did not know it was his performance of the room or his imagination. He was working from memory that he had alternately tried to preserve and discard. The collar and sleeves crisp against his skin, the length of him cosseted by what had to have been made by hand, attention to detail in every stitch. He was close to being properly outfitted for a performance, although perhaps not a recital. That would have required more confining, formal dress. This was like an afternoon of tea or a luncheon, a garden party where the flowers and fascinators would draw all the attention. In his new clothes, his still awful hands, he faded into the furniture, and only the notes baited the limits of the room and its decorum. He had not always been a monster, a bird shorn of its repertoire, a reminder of lost souls in a lost nation. Once he had been a kind of caretaker, one who ferried the moments before sunset as the sun drips down, the deliverer of water in its rebirth from the grip of a dead season. He once plodded to earth to place seedlings in a field. All he would leave behind would be bright, if anonymous. He had not played at this length since his training, when the NCOs would set him up on Saturday nights in a makeshift concert hall. At 1700 hours, after the last meal, the men were shuffled from the junior mess to the rec compound, where the only instrument available was a doddering old thing with a brassy sound. He discovered on one of these Saturday nights that he could play Je t'ai vu and the Valse ballet if he was not too particular about the piano's defects. The men waltzed with each other, there being no women available to partner. He played it over and over, and at the end of the night, the men, still standing, gave him a bracing round of applause. He had kept his eyes open so as not to lose himself, but now he could not stop thinking of other pianos, his own at the third studio in the music school, the hours that he spent with her, the hours that spilled, dissolved, scattered before they could be measured, like the distance between planets. He could not avoid how his playing had changed, how cautious and timid it had become, unable to capture those moments. But he could revisit when he tried to rescue time in music, like moments when diamonds are first exposed before their light turns garish. He would find a way to be in the world after the war and too much time away from the instrument. He could provide each note with the isolation it deserved before it was grafted onto the next. He could make way for the slip of an instant so the phrase could be savored without his crushing it. This was a compromise between music and vacuum, and he would jeopardize neither if he could keep what his hands and body had suffered away from the instrument. With this pledge, he exhaled. He had finished. He bowed his head, then glanced away from the keyboard to Miss Williams. Instead, he found a crowd, with Miss Williams in front. She was holding the hand of the woman who must have been the lady of the house. Behind them were the maids and footmen. The lady of the house looked pale for the season, although he detected a kind of blush pulsing through her neck. Please, the lady said, continue. Sheehan stood. The servants, it seemed, retreated with shuffling. Miss Williams took a step toward him, and Lady Thornton, if he was correct in his identification, turned around briefly as if to invite the servants back. But it was too late. Sheehan had stepped away from the bench, then from the other furniture. He thought of grabbing Miss Williams as he bolted, but it was best to leave her out of this. He leapt as if he were a goat or an antelope, then ran as if he had when sighting a flare, a firebomb, or a grenade. His gait accelerated once he was clear of the house on his way toward the college. His breath was ragged by the time he reached the cottage, his vision blighted. By the hair that fell over his eyes, the sweat that fell into them, the wind he had to press himself into to run without stopping. He took to the nursery, secured the door with a chair, the door that he and Miss Williams had made a habit of leaving open, so that he might know he was neither confined nor unwelcome here. The curtain he pulled shut, the child's chest of drawers pushed against the door as well, a barricade. All he needed now was to find the room's darkest corner. He stripped off the new clothes. In his pants and undershirt, he waited for reinforcements. So I'll read one more excerpt, if that's okay.
It is.
Neither a date nor number on the firefight that consumed his hearing. He could not place which rotation it was when the sound came, how its light might have hollowed out the trench before conveying the sound. The light had to hollow out the trench, for otherwise the sound would not be so effective. A sound redoubled, layer upon layer of vibration and damage. A sound that was more properly noise, but noise could not describe its volume and impact, its fatal musicality. The sound and noise shoved through his ears into his other organs. He was knocked off his haunches, displaced by its pitch. Voices, order, balance. He tried but could not get back on his feet. There was a ringing in his ears, though the sound persisted. It was bottomless and did not echo. It shook the interior of his hearing. He had hardly a moment before the sound pushed its way out, from his ears to his throat and out his mouth. He vomited. His mouth tasted hot, mottled. He buckled over and clenched his jaw, but it was too late. Uniforms, chunks, and swaths. The identification said Peterson, Lansdowne, Watterson, the Jew. They had gotten on, the Jew and Sheehan, the Irishman. Sheehan looked for the man whose uniform switched about him like rags, but he could not find him. Sheehan was on his knees again, in his own sick, in guts and dankness. The orders came again. Stand up to it, men. Don't let up. Don't let up. Sheehan grabbed the grenade on his belt and lobbed it over the front of the trench. The cloth streamer on the grenade spun out like a flag behind it, and Sheehan could be assured the device would hit its mark and explode. But there was no explosion, or he could not hear it. His mouth tasted dirt that fell like hail around him. He spit his lips clean, but just as soon tasted what must have been his own stomach lining, an acidic curdling. He watched for the cloth streamer that would tell him that his grenade had landed on its belly on the wood planks that topped the opposite trench. The Jerrys were sure to throw the thing back at him, and he might be killed or maimed by his own instrument. Dirt rose again in fountains and gullies, and he was on his knees again and retching. On your feet, man, someone shouted, and Sheehan was up like a rabbit, quick and startled, but unable to maintain equilibrium. From where his throat connected to his chest, unrolled in a blunt motion, and the internal flavor of his own decay pushed up against his teeth. He was vomiting again. He could not stop it. Get out of here, man, Sheehan heard, and the arms were suddenly around him from behind, under his armpits. The pandemonium of limbs pulled away from him, and while the light and its echoes pursued his vision, the sound lessened but did not quite fade. It wet itself to the beat of his heart, each intake of air he could trace. A pain in his head became noticeable. It seemed to stopper up the sound, forcing it deeper into the ear canal, to his skull's dead center. He was dragged away from the front, but only temporarily. A sergeant held a number of fingers in front of his face and then asked him something. The only question Sheehan could hear issuing from the officer's lips was the same blasted hum that had overtaken his ears moments earlier. Yet it was clear the sergeant held 4 fingers up on the hand and 3 on the other. Sheehan did the same, and the sergeant smacked him on the head. He yelled something too. Sheehan couldn't make it out, but he got the message as he was shoved in the direction of the fighting. Someone put a rifle, not his own, in his hands. The white burst from the enemy line kept Sheehan occupied, as they were no longer presenting themselves cohesively. They darted and dropped. When they were not climbing through, there was nowhere for them to climb at the front of the line. Sheehan fired. Each time he fired, the noise added a nail into whatever was choking off sound in his ears. He would have thought by morning he'd be completely deaf, if not for the jagged cries of men calling for help, for their mothers, for water, as their fluids and organs flooded over their skins and uniforms. Those did not subside, even to his suffocating eardrums. They struck Sheehan as clear and frenzied, as if they were aimed at him personally, with no space between himself and the dying. But the men did not pile up on his feet as they had during the last firefight, and a notion grew within him as he fired and reloaded, and his hands blackened with gunpowder, and the cries of the men climbed in pitch and shrillness, that he had been left by his fellows to fight on the line solo, that he was the last uninjured man standing between the Jerrys and all of Europe, and he would have to carry on without orders. He did not know what to anticipate once the dawn came and laid its bright shroud on the battlefield, but he would not allow himself to consider the possibility of sleep, of shutting his eyes. Was he to hold the trench forever, or until his unit's return? How would he recognize his unit, since its composition had been wholly swapped or killed? Would it make a difference which unit he fought in, just as long as he shot from his position, when he was not ducking to cough, or heave, or expectorate the last of his fluids from his mouth? For all the fretting he had done over his hands, maintaining their pliancy, the muscle memory that connected notes and chords to reach and fingertips, he had not given a thought to his ears, and he was paying for it now in sweats and dizziness. In the plumes he coughed out onto his uniform, his boots, whatever throttled and gagged beneath him on the ground, he had made the mistake of assuming his ears would survive what might scar his hands. So as long as he kept his head down, his steel on, even with the swirl of the firefight engulfing him, Sheehan could not conceive of even noise causing such damage, yet the destruction was all around him. He could not conceive of the potential for damage because sound was so diffused as to be a spray. It was ambiance and obstacle, what fell through bones and membranes. But those obstacles had deserted him on the battlefield, and what rooted through his ears now was raw and merciless. The passions of lost men intent on pillaging what they wanted but could not have, because they were at war and were being made to desire what could not be held, molded, or forced into subjugation. The beating, bloodthirsty hearts of other men. With all the obstacles removed, from the tree split by mortars to the intricate anatomy of his own hearing scorched to coals and embers, she knew he would have to, I found a typo, to rearrange what he understood about noise and sound, and the blows struck between these categories. He would have to rethink everything he thought light was capable of touching and transforming, and the purpose of any sound that came after. Certainly it would not be to confirm the time of day or announce a job well done, or to entertain or distract, or any of the actions his hands had once been capable of, if they were ever to be capable again. Sound was only for war, as light was only for war, as were trees and flesh and dirt, and any earthly material that remained in steady supply of opposing group of soldiers, himself against the Germans, the English against him. He was going to be deafened by the Jerrys, by his own compatriots. He would never stop firing, supplies and the exposure of daylight be damned. He would fire until his fingers were wetted to the trigger, until the only sound they could make was the click of the mechanisms, ignition to gunpowder to shell. He'd keep firing even when the sergeant tried to grab his rifle and shouted something Sheehan could not make out, for all the fury and might the sergeant unloaded in Sheehan's direction. He'd wrestled the sergeant for the rifles. The sergeant yelled, "Cease fire!" and repeated it endlessly until another man curled Sheehan by the waist and lifted him up as though he was so much rubbish. The bales and mounds of it they threw out of the trench, hoping it would land on the Germans. "Cease fire," the sergeant may have said, "or clean yourself up, man." For all that Sheehan could dig out from his ears and the look of the sergeant, disgusted by the vomit, if not the blood, on Sheehan's uniform. "Get a hold of yourself, or we'll send you up for a courts-martial," the sergeant said as the other man released Sheehan and stood at attention. "You bloody stink, you bog trotter," the sergeant concluded upon leaving the corporal obviously assigned to protect him. Sheehan spat after the pair in the mud before collapsing into it. From the bodies that could not be salvaged with gauze and medicines, Sheehan found a bottle of dressing that, though opened, still had the look of sterility about its contents. During the day, he pulled out the strips of the dressing and worked them between his fingers until the material resembled a plug, a ball of cotton to barricade his ears against the next assault. At night, the light came again and the sound that chased it, and Sheehan, his hearing no less rattled from the explosions the night before, found himself debating the plug's effectiveness until he saw blood shot out of the chest of the man next to him. Sheehan did not know the man. He must have been a replacement, though he could not find any rank insignia, no name or other identifying information readily on him. The man was slumping, the font of his blood weakening, and Sheehan caught the man before he could hit the ground. The man's blood quickly smeared over Sheehan's arm, the one holding him at the back. He was bleeding clear through the chest to the spine. A bullet might very well have done this, but for the volume and persistence of the blood, Sheehan thought it might have been shrapnel that twisted and drilled clear through his heart. He laid the man down beneath the grooves and shifting of the bullets and tried to watch the man speak, but through the flashes of light, he could hear nothing and discern only the ghoulish hold the light imposed on sense and movement. For this man, there would be no final words. With the plugs in his ears, Sheehan remained fully aware of each explosion, but their sounds fell at his shoulders as if their impact were delayed, shortened before they could tear their way through his concentration. Now it was the light that most affected his perception of the battlefield, what he could separate from other constituents. A pair of eyes for another pair, uniforms torn from limbs, mud that flicked around skin, teeth, fingernails, foreheads. The shells were unceasing, and their reverberations shifted from the bodies and air around Sheehan to his sternum. His arms became useless, immune to how he might have directed them. The light was renewed in its brilliance. Another shell launched, and in the flash, Sheehan could not hear the sergeant, blood on one side of his neck, pumping out in distinct globules. The sergeant's wounds would be blocked soon enough with trench beetles and worms.